Mud splattered across Julian's boots as he pulled the injured groom out from under the frightened horse, his own coat torn at the shoulder from the animal's kick. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from an idea that had taken hold of him the moment he saw the young man's face twisted in pain. "Get him to the house," Julian said to the nearest hand, keeping his voice low and rough, nothing like the voice a duke would use. "I will take his place until he is well again." The stable master, an older man named Thomas Bell, blinked at him twice before understanding dawned. "Your Grace, you cannot mean to work the stables yourself." "I can, and I will," Julian said. "No one here besides you will know who I am. Not the staff, not my aunt, not anyone." 3 days earlier, Julian had stood in a ballroom in London, listening to a young woman describe, in painstaking detail, the exact acreage of his estate and the value of his townhouse, all while smiling at him as though she were reciting poetry. She had not asked him a single question about himself. Not his thoughts, not his fears, not what kept him awake at night. Only numbers. Only titles. Only the weight of his name. He had left the ballroom without saying goodbye to his hostess, climbed into his carriage, and ridden through the night back to Ashcombe, his family's estate in the countryside, arriving just as the sun rose over the fields. He told no one he had returned early. He simply walked toward the stables, drawn by the quiet sound of horses shifting in their stalls, and there he found the accident that gave him his opportunity. Now, standing in a borrowed shirt that smelled of hay and leather, Julian felt something strange settle over him. Freedom. For the first time in years, no one was watching him to see how a duke should behave. He took the name Tom. It was close enough to his own that he would not forget to answer to it, but different enough that no one would think twice. Thomas Bell agreed to keep his secret, mostly because he understood exactly what drove a young duke to such foolishness. He had seen it before, in Julian's father, years ago, though that was a story for another day. The work was harder than Julian expected. His hands blistered within the first hour, and by midday his back ached from lifting feed and mucking stalls. He said nothing about the pain. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, determined to prove to himself, if no one else, that he could last more than a single afternoon. It was near evening, when the light had turned soft and gold across the fields, that he first saw her. She was walking along the garden path that bordered the stable yard, a basket of cut flowers balanced against her hip, humming a tune he did not recognize. Her dress was simple, the color of faded lavender, patched at the hem where it had worn thin. Her hair, the color of chestnut, had come loose from its pins and curled softly around her face. She did not carry herself like the women of London, with their practiced grace and careful smiles. She walked like someone who had nowhere important to be and no one to impress, and there was something magnetic in that ease. She noticed him watching and smiled, not the polished smile he was used to, but something warmer, more genuine. "You must be the new stable hand," she said. "I heard about the accident this morning. Is Peter recovering well?" Julian, who a moment ago could not remember the injured groom's actual name, nodded quickly. "He will heal, I believe. The doctor came to see him." "Good. He has a wife expecting their first child next month. He cannot afford to be laid up for long." She shifted the basket on her hip and studied Julian with open curiosity. "I don't believe I've seen you before. Are you new to the county or new to the estate?" "New to the estate," Julian said carefully. "My name is Tom." "Eleanor Hartley," she said, and held out her hand, as though he were her equal, as though rank meant nothing at all. Julian stared at her hand for a moment too long before he took it, startled by the simple gesture. No woman in London had ever offered her bare hand to him without gloves, without ceremony, without calculation. "You seem surprised," Eleanor said, tilting her head. "I did not expect such kindness from a stranger," Julian admitted, and it was the truest thing he had said all day. "Kindness costs nothing," she replied, "and this county could use more of it." She glanced toward the manor house in the distance, its windows catching the last of the sunlight. "Do you know the Duke well?" "I understand he has just returned from London." Julian's chest tightened. "I know very little about him. They say he is cold, distant, more concerned with his ledgers than his people." Eleanor's voice held no malice, only honest observation. "But I have also heard that he quietly pays for the roof repairs on the old chapel, though he never lets his name be attached to the gift." I do not know which story to believe." Julian said nothing, unsure how to respond to hearing himself described by someone who did not know she was speaking to him. "Well," Eleanor said, shifting her basket again, "I should get these flowers to my father before the evening grows too cold. He has been unwell, and fresh flowers always seem to lift his spirits, even if the doctor insists they do nothing for his lungs." She smiled once more, easy and unguarded. "It was nice meeting you, Tom. I hope Peter recovers quickly, and that you find your place here." She walked on before he could think of anything worthy to say in return, disappearing down the path toward a small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds. Julian stood there long after she had gone, turning her words over in his mind. Cold, distant. He had never thought of himself that way, yet he understood, with an uncomfortable clarity, why others might. That night, in the small room above the stables where Peter usually slept, Julian lay awake on a thin mattress that did nothing to soften the wooden boards beneath it. He thought of the ballroom in London, the woman reciting his assets like a merchant counting coins. He thought of his aunt's letters, each one pressing him toward a marriage built on convenience and family alliance. And he thought of Eleanor Hartley, who had offered her bare hand to a stranger in stable clothes, and asked nothing of him at all. He told himself this was only an experiment, a brief escape from the pressures waiting for him inside the manor house. He would return to his real life within a week, perhaps 2, once he had proven whatever it was he needed to prove. He was not looking for anything more than that. But sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, his last waking thought was not of ledgers or titles or the marriage his family expected of him. It was of lavender fabric, worn soft at the hem, and a voice that asked nothing but gave everything, and a woman who had looked at a stable hand and seen a person worth knowing. The next morning, Julian woke before dawn, his body sore in places he did not know could ache. He forced himself upright, splashed cold water on his face from the basin in the corner, and stepped out into the gray morning light to begin his work. Thomas Bell was already waiting, a list of tasks in hand, and he studied Julian with a knowing look. "You met Miss Hartley yesterday," Thomas said. It was not a question. Julian paused, a bucket of feed in his hands. "How did you know?" "Because for the first time since you arrived, you look like a man with something to think about, besides horses." Thomas allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Careful, Your Grace. That young woman has broken hearts before, though never intentionally. She simply cares for people the way most folks save for their closest kin, and it makes a man forget himself." Julian said nothing, but he carried Thomas's words with him through the long hours of work that followed, through the mucking of stalls and the mending of tack, and the endless list of chores that filled a stable hand's day. Every so often, he found himself glancing toward the garden path, hoping to catch another glimpse of lavender fabric and chestnut hair. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he was simply curious about the woman who had spoken so freely about the Duke she had never truly met. But when evening came, and Eleanor did not appear on the path, Julian felt an unmistakable pang of disappointment settle in his chest, and he understood, with growing unease, that his simple experiment had already become something far more complicated than he intended. On the third day, a letter arrived from his aunt, carried by a rider who nearly discovered him in the stable yard, before Thomas hurried the man toward the kitchen entrance instead. Julian read the letter later that night by candlelight, hidden away in the small room above the stalls. His aunt wrote of a Lady Margaret Fenwick, a woman of excellent family and modest fortune, who would be visiting Ashcombe within the fortnight. She wrote of duty, of the family name, of the importance of securing the line before rumors of his unmarried state grew troublesome among their peers. Julian folded the letter and set it aside without finishing it twice, as he usually did. Lady Margaret's name meant nothing to him, beyond the pages of a ledger listing her family's connections and holdings. He tried to picture her face, and could not. He tried to imagine a conversation with her that did not involve estates or inheritances, and found the effort strangely difficult. He thought instead of Eleanor's hand, offered so freely without gloves or ceremony, and the way she had spoken of the Duke, as though he were simply a man like any other, capable of both coldness and quiet kindness. She had not known who she was speaking to, and yet she had spoken honestly, without the careful calculation he had grown so used to in London. The following afternoon, Julian found an excuse to walk near the garden path, while carrying a length of rope toward the far paddock, though the paddock hardly required it. He told himself this was simply the shortest route between two chores. He knew, even as he thought it, that it was not entirely true. Eleanor was there again, kneeling beside a bed of late roses, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows as she pulled weeds from the soil, with quick, practiced movements. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and offered him the same warm smile from before, as though 2 days had not passed at all. "Tom," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "How is Peter faring?" "Better," Julian said, grateful for once to have an honest answer. "The doctor says he should be back on his feet within the week." "That is good news. His wife will be relieved." Eleanor sat back on her heels and studied the roses with a critical eye. "These have not been properly tended in months. I try to come by when I can, but the head gardener has enough to manage without adding my opinions to his work."
"Why do you bother then?" Julian asked, genuinely curious.
"Because someone should," Eleanor said simply, as though the answer were obvious. "Beautiful things fade quickly when no one cares for them. It seems a shame to let that happen, when a little effort could prevent it." She glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you not think so, Tom?" Julian, standing there in borrowed clothes with dirt beneath his fingernails, found himself nodding slowly. "I think you may be the only honest person I have spoken with in a very long time." Eleanor laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to startle even the birds in the nearby hedge. "That is either a very great compliment or a very sad statement about the company you have been keeping." "Perhaps both," Julian admitted, and for the first time since arriving at the stables, he found himself smiling without effort, without the careful control he had practiced for years, in rooms filled with people who wanted something from him. Eleanor Hartley wanted nothing from him at all, and that, more than anything, was what made him want to stay. Smoke curled from the chimney of the small cottage at the edge of the estate, and Julian found himself standing across the lane from it far too often for a man who claimed he was only passing by. A week had gone by since the accident that gave him his disguise, and Peter, the injured groom, still needed several more days before he could return to his duties. Julian did not mind the delay. He told himself it was simply convenient. Eleanor had begun greeting him by name each time their paths crossed, and Julian had started to notice the small details of her days. She rose early to tend her father, who suffered from a weakness in his lungs that grew worse with the changing seasons. She spent her mornings in the estate gardens, earning a modest wage that helped keep their small household running. In the afternoons, she often gathered the village children beneath the old oak tree near the chapel, teaching them their letters from a worn book she kept wrapped in cloth to protect it from the weather. "You are a teacher," Julian said one afternoon, when he found her sitting beneath that same oak tree, a half circle of children around her, sounding out words from her book. "Not officially," Eleanor said, once the children had scattered toward their homes for supper. "There is no school in the village, not really. A few of us take turns teaching what we can. I dream of something more, someday. A proper schoolhouse, with real books and a real teacher who is paid to be there, instead of doing it between chores." "What stops you from building it?" Julian asked. Eleanor's laugh held no bitterness, only quiet resignation. "Money, mostly, and influence. A schoolhouse needs land and materials, and someone willing to grant permission for it to exist. I have none of those things, Tom. I have only the wish." Julian said nothing, but the seed of an idea began to take root in his mind, one he could not act upon without revealing who he truly was. Not yet, at least. Their conversations grew longer as the days passed. Julian learned that Eleanor's mother had died when she was young, leaving her father to raise her alone, and that her father had once worked as a bookkeeper for a merchant in the nearby town before his illness made steady work impossible. He learned that she loved the smell of rain on dry soil, that she had never traveled farther than the county town 20 miles away, and that she read whatever books she could borrow from the small collection kept at the local church. In turn, Julian found himself sharing pieces of truth, disguised as a stable hand's simple observations. He spoke of feeling trapped by expectations he never chose for himself, of loneliness in rooms crowded with people, of wanting to be seen for something other than what he could offer others. Eleanor listened to these confessions with a quiet attentiveness that no one in London had ever offered him, and slowly, Without meaning to, Julian began to trust her with pieces of his real heart, even while hiding his real name. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of amber, Eleanor found Julian near the paddock fence, watching the horses graze in the fading light. She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her clothes. "You are not like the other men who work here," she said, studying him with a curious tilt of her head. Julian's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "You speak differently. You carry yourself differently, as though you were raised to expect something else from life. And your hands," she said, glancing down at them. "They are healing from blisters, but underneath, they do not look like a laborer's hands." Julian's mouth went dry. He had not considered how closely she might be watching him, how easily small details might betray the truth he worked so hard to conceal. "I have not always worked with horses," he said carefully, choosing each word as though walking across thin ice. "I had a different life before this. I am not eager to speak of it." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, and Julian braced himself for further questions. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting his answer, without pushing further. "Everyone carries something they are not ready to share," she said gently. "I will not pry, Tom, but know that whatever you left behind, you are welcome here, as you are." Her kindness struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had spent years surrounded by people eager to uncover his secrets for their own advantage, and here was a woman who sensed he was hiding something and chose grace instead of suspicion. It undid something in him, some carefully guarded wall he had built without realizing it. That night, unable to sleep, Julian made a decision. He could not fund a schoolhouse as Tom the stable hand, not without revealing himself, but he could plant the first seeds toward such a project quietly, through the estate's steward, under the pretense of a charitable improvement the Duke wished to make for the village. He drafted a brief note the following morning, disguising his handwriting as best he could, and left it where his steward, a trusted and discreet man named Charles Whitmore, would find it upon his next visit to the estate offices. Days later, word began to spread through the village that the Duke intended to fund the construction of a small schoolhouse near the chapel, to be built before winter set in. Eleanor heard the news from one of the other gardeners and came running to find Julian near the stables, her eyes bright with disbelief and joy. "Tom, have you heard? The Duke is building us a school, a real school, with a proper teacher and real books." She laughed, spinning slightly in her excitement, her basket nearly slipping from her grip. "I did not think he cared for such things. Perhaps I misjudged him." Julian caught the basket before it fell and handed it back to her, fighting to keep his expression neutral despite the warmth spreading through his chest at her happiness. "Perhaps everyone deserves a chance to be misjudged and then proven otherwise," he said. Eleanor smiled up at him, her joy softening into something quieter, something that made Julian's pulse stumble. "That is a kind thought, Tom. I did not expect a stable hand to have such wisdom hidden in him." "There are many things hidden that people do not expect," Julian replied, and though he meant it as a jest, the words carried a weight he could not fully disguise. As the days turned into weeks, Julian found himself dreading the return of Peter, the true stable hand, whose recovery grew steadier by the day. Once Peter returned to his post, Julian would have no reason to remain in the stables, no excuse to walk the garden paths, or sit beneath the old oak tree listening to children sound out their letters. He would have to return to the manor house, to his true name, to the mounting pressure of his aunt's letters, and the visit from Lady Margaret Fenwick, that loomed ever closer on the calendar. He began to understand, with growing unease, that his simple experiment to test the hearts of those around him had shifted into something far more dangerous. He was no longer testing Eleanor. He was falling for her, deeply and honestly, in a way he had never fallen for anyone in the calculated world of London society. And soon, he would have to choose between the comfortable anonymity of Tom the stable hand and the truth of who he really was, a truth that might shatter everything Eleanor believed about the man she had grown to care for. One quiet evening, as autumn winds began to strip the leaves from the estate's ancient trees, Eleanor's father took a turn for the worse. Julian learned of it from Thomas Bell, who had heard the news from a maid passing through the village. Without thinking twice, Julian made his way to the small cottage, arriving just as the local doctor was leaving, his expression grave. He found Eleanor sitting on the front step, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Julian sat beside her without a word, offering his presence as the only comfort he could give, without revealing more than he dared. "He is so tired," Eleanor whispered, staring at nothing. "Every winter takes a little more from him, and I fear one of these winters will take everything." Julian reached over and took her hand, and this time, she did not pull away. "You are not alone in this," he said quietly. "Whatever you need, I will help however I am able." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes glistening in the fading light, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them said more than words ever could, and Julian understood, with sudden clarity, that walking away from this woman, when the truth finally emerged, would be the hardest thing he had ever done. The following morning, Julian arranged, through another quiet note to Charles Whitmore, for the estate's own physician to call upon Eleanor's father, along with a supply of medicine that the local doctor had been unable to provide. He instructed that the gift be attributed to the estate's general charity fund, nothing that would point directly to the Duke, let alone to a stable hand named Tom. When Eleanor learned of the physician's visit, she came to find Julian at the paddock fence once more, her expression a mixture of relief and confusion. "The Duke's own physician came to see my father," she said, still catching her breath from hurrying across the grounds. "He left medicine that eased his breathing within hours. I do not understand it, Tom. Why would a man I have never met show such kindness to a gardener's daughter?" Julian kept his eyes fixed on the horses grazing beyond the fence, careful not to let his expression give away the truth. "Perhaps he understands that kindness does not need to be explained to be genuine," he said. "Perhaps he simply wished to help." "Perhaps," Eleanor echoed, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. She studied Julian for a long moment, as though searching for something in his face, before shaking her head slightly and letting the matter rest. "Whatever his reasons, I am grateful." My father slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. As autumn deepened, a new figure began appearing in the village, a merchant's son named William Carow, whose father had recently expanded his trade routes and grown considerably wealthy in the process. William had taken notice of Eleanor during a visit to the county town, and he began making regular trips to the village under the pretense of business, though everyone understood his true purpose. He was polite, well-dressed, and clearly interested in securing Eleanor's hand, offering her family the kind of security her modest wages could never provide. Julian first learned of William's visits from the village gossip that traveled quickly through the stable yard, carried by grooms and maids who found endless entertainment in speculating about romantic matters that did not concern them. He told himself it meant nothing to him, that Eleanor's choices were her own to make, but the knot that formed in his stomach, each time William's name was mentioned, told a different story entirely. He saw them together only once during those early weeks, from a distance, as William helped Eleanor's father onto a bench outside the cottage with careful, practiced courtesy. Eleanor smiled at William's attentiveness, a polite smile, nothing like the warm, unguarded expressions she offered Tom, yet Julian felt a sharp and unfamiliar pang of jealousy regardless. He had no right to such feelings, he reminded himself. He was a stable hand in her eyes, a temporary presence in her life, while William Carow could offer her a stable future, free from the worry that shadowed her days. That evening, Julian found Eleanor alone near the chapel, sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the small graveyard where her mother was buried. She looked up when he approached, and something in her expression told him she had been thinking of matters far heavier than flowers or roses. "William asked to call on my father formally," she said quietly, before Julian could speak. "He wishes to court me properly, with my father's blessing." Julian's chest tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to consider it," Eleanor said, plucking absently at a loose thread on her sleeve. "He is a good man, Tom. Steady, kind, capable of providing for my father and me, in ways I cannot manage alone. It would be foolish to refuse him without good reason." "Is there a reason?" Julian asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Eleanor looked up at him then, and something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. "I do not know," she admitted softly. "There might be. I am not entirely certain of my own heart these days." Julian wanted, more than anything, to tell her the truth in that moment, to confess who he truly was, and what he truly felt. But the fear of her reaction, The fear that she might see his deception as no different from William's calculated courtship held his tongue in place. Instead, he simply nodded, swallowing the words that threatened to spill out, and let the evening settle into silence between them, heavy with everything neither of them dared to say aloud. A carriage, bearing the Fenwick family crest, rolled up the long drive of Ashcombe, just as Julian was mucking out the last stall of the morning, and his stomach dropped at the sight of it through the stable window. He had lost track of the days since the letter arrived, and now Lady Margaret Fenwick had come earlier than expected, along with his aunt, and there was no time to prepare a proper return to his role as Duke. "Your Grace," Charles Whitmore hissed, finding him near the stalls with barely concealed panic in his eyes. "They arrived an hour early. Your aunt is asking for you at the house, and I cannot delay them much longer without raising suspicion." Julian wiped his hands on a rag and cursed under his breath, a word he had not spoken since his university days. "Tell her I am indisposed. Tell her anything. I need time to change and compose myself before I can appear as the Duke." "And Peter?" Charles asked. "The staff will notice if the stable hand vanishes and the Duke appears within the same hour." "Peter returns to full duty tomorrow, regardless," Julian said, already moving toward the small room above the stalls where he kept a set of proper clothes hidden for precisely this kind of emergency. "Tell the staff Tom has taken ill and gone to stay with family for a few days. It will hold long enough." He dressed quickly, transforming from a weary stable hand into the composed figure of the Duke of Ashcombe within the span of 20 minutes, though the transformation felt less complete than it once had. His hands, still rough from weeks of labor, fumbled slightly with his cravat, and his mind remained fixed on Eleanor, rather than the noblewoman waiting to greet him in the drawing room. His aunt, Lady Constance, embraced him with visible relief when he finally appeared. "Julian, wherever have you been hiding? You look thinner. Have you been eating properly?" "I have been occupied with estate matters," Julian said, which was not entirely a lie. "Forgive my delay, Aunt. I did not expect you and Lady Margaret so early in the day." Lady Margaret Fenwick proved to be exactly as unremarkable as Julian had feared, pleasant enough in conversation, well versed in the expected topics of weather and society gossip, but utterly without the spark that had drawn him so quickly to Eleanor. She spoke of her family's recent acquisitions, of a new carriage her father had purchased, of the upcoming season in London, and which families would be hosting the most notable events. Julian nodded along, offering polite responses, his mind wandering repeatedly to the garden paths, and the woman who tended roses there, without any thought of impressing him. The visit stretched into 2 days, filled with formal dinners and careful conversation, during which Julian found himself desperate for any excuse to slip away toward the stables, if only to catch a glimpse of Eleanor from a distance. He managed it only once, standing at a window on the second floor of the manor house, watching her walk the garden path with her basket, unaware that the Duke she had never properly met was watching her with an intensity he could not fully explain to himself. On the second evening, disaster nearly struck when Lord Fenwick, Margaret's father, who had arrived separately for a brief visit, recognized something familiar in a groom crossing the courtyard as the family carriage was being prepared. Julian, who had ventured out disguised in a plain coat to check on the horses before the family's departure, felt his blood run cold as Lord Fenwick squinted at him from across the yard. "You there," Lord Fenwick called. "Have we met before? You have a familiar look about you." Julian kept his head down, adjusting a saddle strap that needed no adjustment. "I could not say, my lord. I have worked these stables my whole life." Lord Fenwick studied him a moment longer, before shrugging and turning back toward his daughter, the moment passing without further incident, though Julian's heart continued to pound, long after the carriage disappeared down the drive. The close call left him shaken, aware more than ever of how fragile his disguise truly was, and how quickly everything could unravel. Eleanor, meanwhile, had grown increasingly puzzled by Tom's sudden absence during the days of the Fenwick visit. When he finally returned to the stables, resuming his role once his aunt and the noblewoman had departed, Eleanor found him near the paddock fence, her expression guarded in a way he had not seen before. "You vanished for 2 days," she said, without preamble. "Thomas Bell said you were ill and staying with family, but you look perfectly well to me." Julian's mind raced for an explanation that would not require an outright lie, though the line between careful omission and deception had grown increasingly blurred over the past weeks. "A family matter required my attention," he said. "It is resolved now." "You have family nearby?" Eleanor asked, her tone carrying a note of genuine curiosity, rather than accusation, though the accusation seemed to hover just beneath the surface regardless. "You have never mentioned them before." "There is much I have not mentioned," Julian admitted, and the honesty in that statement, though vague, seemed to soften Eleanor's guarded expression slightly. "I saw a fine carriage leaving the estate 2 days ago," Eleanor continued, watching him carefully as she spoke. "The staff said it belonged to a noble family visiting the Duke. Some say a young lady came to meet him, perhaps as a potential match. Do you know anything of it, working so close to the manor house?" Julian's throat tightened. "I know very little of the Duke's personal affairs," he said, which was, in its own strange way, entirely true. He knew everything of his own affairs, and nothing of how to reconcile them with the man standing before Eleanor now. "I hope, whoever she was, that she saw him clearly," Eleanor said, turning her attention back to the horses grazing nearby. "It seems a difficult thing, doesn't it, to know if someone loves you for yourself, or simply for what you can offer them. I imagine it must be especially difficult for a man in his position, surrounded by people who want something from him." Her words struck closer to the truth than she could possibly know, and Julian found himself studying her profile in the afternoon light, struck once again by how effortlessly she understood things that had taken him years of painful experience to learn. "You speak as though you pity him," Julian said. "Perhaps I do, a little," Eleanor admitted, "though I also envy him his choices. He could build a school for an entire village, with barely a thought to the cost. I could not build one if I saved every coin I earned for the rest of my life." She sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It is strange, is it not, how much power some people hold without ever having to fight for it, while others fight endlessly and still fall short." Julian said nothing, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He thought of Lady Margaret Fenwick, who had everything Eleanor lacked in terms of fortune and standing, yet possessed none of the warmth or depth that made Eleanor so extraordinary. He thought of his own privilege, the ease with which he had built a schoolhouse with a single note to his steward, while Eleanor had carried her dream for years without the means to make it real. "If you could have anything," Julian asked slowly, "beyond the schoolhouse, what would you wish for?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, her eyes distant as she thought it over. "I would wish for my father to grow strong again, though I know that may not be possible. And I would wish," she added, glancing at him with a small, uncertain smile, "for the freedom to choose my own path, rather than the path that seems most sensible for my family's survival." "What path would you choose, if survival were not a concern?" Julian pressed, unable to stop himself. Eleanor's smile grew softer, tinged with something that looked almost like sadness. "I think you already know the answer to that, Tom, even if neither of us says it aloud." The moment stretched between them, charged with everything left unspoken, until the sound of William Caro's approaching carriage broke the spell entirely. Eleanor straightened, smoothing her skirts, and Julian watched with a tightening chest as William climbed down from his carriage, offering Eleanor a polite bow and a bouquet of flowers purchased from the county town. "Miss Hartley," William said warmly, "I hoped I might walk with you a while, if you are free." Eleanor glanced back at Julian briefly before accepting William's offered arm, and Julian stood alone at the paddock fence, watching them walk away together, understanding with painful clarity that his time to make a decision was running shorter with each passing day. He could not remain Tom the stable hand forever, hiding behind borrowed clothes and careful half-truths, while William Caro offered Eleanor a future built on honesty, however dull that future might be, compared to what Julian truly felt for her. That night, Julian sat alone in the small room above the stalls, staring at a blank sheet of paper he had intended to use for another anonymous note to his steward. Instead, he found himself writing Eleanor's name, over and over, followed by words he could not bring himself to send, confessions of feeling that had grown far too large to contain within the boundaries of his disguise. He thought of Lord Fenwick's suspicious glance in the courtyard, of how close his secret had come to unraveling, and understood that time was no longer on his side. The following morning brought fresh trouble. Charles Whitmore arrived at the stables under the pretense of inspecting the horses, though his real purpose became clear the moment the two men were alone. "Your Grace, several of the staff have begun to talk," Charles said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one else could hear. They find it strange that Tom disappeared for 2 days precisely when the Fenwick family visited, and stranger still that he returned the very evening they departed. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, mentioned it to me directly, though I do not believe she suspects the truth. Others may not be so easily satisfied. Julian felt the walls of his disguise pressing more tightly around him with each passing day. What would you have me do, Charles? I cannot simply announce myself without destroying everything I have built here. I would have you consider, Your Grace, what you are truly building, Charles said carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had served the family for many years and earned the right to speak plainly. A disguise, built on deception, cannot support genuine affection forever. The longer you wait, the more painful the truth will become when it finally surfaces, and surface it will. These things always do. Julian said nothing, though Charles's words lingered with him throughout the day's labor, echoing every time he caught sight of Eleanor moving between the garden beds. He watched her interact with William Caro again that afternoon, noting the easy, comfortable way William spoke with her father, the practical gifts he brought each visit, small comforts meant to ease the older man's illness. William was not a villain in this story, Julian realized with some discomfort. He was simply an honest man, offering an honest courtship, free of the elaborate deception Julian had constructed around his own feelings. That evening, Eleanor found Julian repairing a section of fence near the paddock, and she lingered nearby rather than continuing on her way, as though something weighed on her mind that she wished to share. William asked me again today, she said finally, watching Julian work rather than meeting his eyes directly. He wishes for an answer before the month ends. He says a man in his position cannot wait indefinitely, and I understand his reasoning, even if I find myself reluctant to give him what he wants. Julian set down his tools, giving her his full attention. What holds you back, if his offer is as sensible as you say? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve between her fingers. I keep thinking of something my mother told me before she passed, when I was still quite young. She said that a marriage built only on practicality is a house built on sand, sturdy enough in fair weather, but easily washed away when the storms come. She married my father for love, even though it meant a harder life than she might have had otherwise, and she never once regretted it, even in her final days. And you believe William's offer is built on sand? Julian asked. I believe William's offer is built on kindness and practicality, which are not unworthy things, Eleanor said carefully. But I do not believe it is built on the kind of love my mother spoke of. Not for me, at least, and I fear not truly for him either, though he may not realize it himself. Then why do you consider it at all? Julian pressed, his voice quieter than before. Eleanor finally met his eyes, and something raw and uncertain passed across her face. Because my father grows weaker each season, Tom, and I cannot support us both on a gardener's wages forever. Because the heart I might wish to follow belongs to someone I hardly know the truth of, someone who vanishes without explanation and returns with secrets he will not share. I cannot build a future on a feeling I do not fully understand, however strongly I feel it. The admission struck Julian like a physical blow, both the confession of her feelings and the accusation buried within it. She was not wrong to be cautious. He had given her every reason to doubt him, even as his own heart had grown certain beyond question. Eleanor, he began, the weight of a confession rising in his throat, ready to spill forth, despite every instinct telling him to remain silent a while longer. Before he could continue, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them, and one of the younger stable boys came running toward the paddock, breathless and wide-eyed. Tom, come quickly, the boy called. One of the horses has gotten loose near the north pasture, and it's heading toward the road. Mr. Bell needs every able hand. The moment shattered instantly, practical urgency replacing the fragile intimacy that had built between them. Julian glanced once more at Eleanor, an unspoken promise passing between them that this conversation was not finished, before hurrying off toward the pasture, leaving her standing alone in the gathering dusk with her half-spoken doubts and his half-spoken confession hanging unresolved in the evening air. It took the better part of an hour to catch the runaway horse and settle it safely back in its stall, and by the time Julian returned to the paddock fence, Eleanor had already gone, called back to her cottage by the sound of her father coughing through the thin walls. Julian stood alone in the darkening yard, frustration and longing warring within him in equal measure, and resolved, finally, that he would find a way to tell her the truth before another chance slipped away, before William Carrow's patience ran out, and before the fragile world he had built inside this disguise collapsed entirely without his consent. Rain hammered against the stable roof as Julian paced the narrow room above the stalls. A half-finished letter to Eleanor, crumpled and discarded on the floor beside 3 others, just like it. He had tried, over the past several days, to find the right words to explain who he truly was. But every attempt sounded either too formal or too desperate, and none of them captured the depth of what he needed her to understand. Below, he could hear Peter moving among the horses, fully recovered now and back to his usual duties. Julian's excuse for remaining at the stables had grown thinner with each passing day, and Thomas Bell had already begun asking, gently but persistently, when Tom intended to move on to other work, as the estate could not justify 2 grooms performing the same tasks indefinitely. "You cannot stay forever," Thomas said one morning, finding Julian staring blankly at a saddle he had been meant to clean for the better part of an hour. "Whatever you are working toward, Your Grace, the clock is ticking louder than you realize." Julian knew Thomas was right. Yet each time he resolved to seek out Eleanor and confess everything, circumstance seemed to intervene, whether through estate business requiring his attention, or Eleanor's own schedule, filled with caring for her ailing father. The days slipped past in a frustrating cycle of near misses and unfinished conversations, and Julian felt the walls of his disguise closing in around him with mounting urgency. The situation grew more complicated when a formal invitation arrived from Lady Constance, informing Julian that she intended to host a grand autumn ball at Ashcombe within the fortnight, an event meant to formally introduce Lady Margaret Fenwick to the wider society of the county, and, unspoken but clearly implied, to move their courtship toward a more definite conclusion. Julian read the invitation with a growing sense of dread, understanding that such an event would require his full presence as the Duke, leaving no room for further disappearances into the stable yard. He found Eleanor 2 days later, sitting beneath the old oak tree near the chapel, her small collection of village children gathered around her as she guided them through their letters. He waited patiently until the lesson concluded and the children scattered toward their homes before approaching her. "You look troubled," Eleanor said, closing her worn book and setting it carefully in her lap. "Is something wrong?" Julian sat beside her on the low stone wall, choosing his words with more care than he had ever needed before. "I must tell you something, Eleanor, and I fear it will change how you see me." Eleanor's expression grew wary, though she did not pull away. "You have been building toward this confession for weeks, I think. I have felt it, in the way you speak, in the things you almost say and then do not." She studied him closely. "Whatever it is, Tom, I would rather hear it plainly than continue guessing in the dark." Julian opened his mouth to begin, the truth finally ready to spill forth after weeks of careful concealment, when the sound of a carriage approaching the chapel interrupted them both. Julian turned to see his aunt's carriage rolling up the lane, evidently searching for him, and his stomach dropped as Lady Constance herself stepped down, her sharp eyes immediately finding him seated beside Eleanor.
"There you are!"
Lady Constance called, her tone carrying an edge of impatience that suggested she had been searching for some time. "Julian, we must discuss the seating arrangements for the ball before Lady Margaret arrives this afternoon. I have been searching the entire estate for you." The name Julian hung in the air between them, unmistakable and impossible to explain away. Eleanor's face went pale as understanding dawned across her features, her eyes moving from Lady Constance to Julian with dawning, horrified comprehension. "Julian," Eleanor repeated softly, testing the name as though it belonged to a stranger. "You are the Duke." Lady Constance, oblivious to the significance of the moment, continued speaking about seating charts and flower arrangements, but her words faded into meaningless noise as Julian watched Eleanor's expression shift from confusion to hurt to something colder, more guarded, a wall rising between them faster than he could tear it down. "Eleanor," Julian said, rising quickly, reaching for her hand, though she pulled it away before he could take it. "Let me explain. I wanted to tell you myself. I was trying to tell you just now, before. You let me believe you were a stable hand," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but sharp with betrayal. You let me speak of the Duke as though he were a stranger to me, while you stood there, listening to every word, knowing exactly who I meant." She stood abruptly, clutching her book of letters against her chest, like a shield. "How long, Tom? How long have you been laughing at me, watching me believe in things that were never true?" "I was never laughing," Julian said desperately. "I swear to you, everything I felt was real. I disguised myself, because I needed to know if anyone could care for me, without knowing what I could offer them. And you, Eleanor, you offered me more genuine kindness than anyone I have ever known." "You tested me," Eleanor said, the words landing like a slap. "You made me part of some experiment, without my knowledge or consent, and now you expect me to feel grateful that I passed whatever measure you were using to judge my worth?" Her voice cracked slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. "I spoke to you honestly, Tom, or whoever you are, because I believed you were an honest man, deserving of honest words. I never imagined I was being studied like a specimen in some experiment for your own peace of mind." Julian felt the full weight of her accusation settle over him, understanding for the first time how his actions, however well-intentioned, must appear from her perspective. "That was never my intention," he said quietly. "I did not set out to hurt you. I set out only to escape a life that had made me doubt everyone's motives, and instead of finding an experiment, I found something real. I found you." Eleanor's eyes glistened, though she blinked back whatever emotion threatened to surface, replacing it instead with the same guarded composure she likely used with strangers of rank and title. "Your Grace," she said formally, the title landing between them like a closed door, "I must return to my father. He will be expecting me." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Julian standing beside his oblivious aunt, who had finally noticed the tension crackling in the air, but understood none of its cause. "Julian, whoever was that young woman, she seemed rather familiar with you for a common gardener," Lady Constance said, studying her nephew with new curiosity. "No one of consequence," Julian said, the lie tasting bitter, even as it left his mouth, a painful echo of every deception he had woven over the past weeks. He watched Eleanor's retreating figure disappear down the lane, understanding that he had just witnessed the collapse of everything he had built, brought down not by careful discovery, but by the simple, careless slip of his aunt's tongue. That evening, Julian returned to the manor house properly for the first time in weeks, shedding the borrowed clothes of Tom the stable hand for the fine attire befitting his station, though the transformation felt hollow, stripped of any satisfaction it might once have carried. He stood before the mirror in his private chambers, studying the reflection of a duke he no longer fully recognized, a man surrounded by every comfort and privilege imaginable, yet more alone than he had ever felt during his weeks of humble labor in the stables. Word of William Caro's renewed visits reached him within days, carried through the estate's ever-active gossip network. Eleanor, it was said, had finally agreed to consider William's proposal seriously, her father's failing health lending new urgency to a decision she could no longer afford to delay. Julian heard the news while reviewing estate ledgers in his study, and the numbers before him blurred into meaningless columns as a hollow ache settled deep in his chest. He thought of writing to her, of explaining himself more fully than the rushed, incomplete confession forced upon them both by his aunt's untimely arrival. He drafted letter after letter, each one discarded as inadequate, unable to capture the depth of regret and genuine affection he needed her to understand. Words on paper felt insufficient for the damage his deception had caused, however honest his underlying feelings had been throughout their weeks together. Charles Whitmore found him late one evening, still staring at a blank sheet of paper, candle burned low beside him. "Your Grace, forgive my boldness, but perhaps a letter is not what the situation requires." Miss Hartley did not fall for words on a page. She fell for a man who worked beside her, who listened to her, who shared her days rather than merely writing about them from a distance. Julian looked up at his steward, understanding slowly dawning through the fog of his despair. "You believe I should go to her directly?" "I believe, Your Grace, that trust broken by deception is rarely repaired through further distance," Charles said carefully. "Whatever you choose to do, it must be more than words. It must be proof, sustained over time, that the man she knew as Tom and the Duke, standing before her now, are one and the same, worthy of the trust she once so freely gave." Julian set down his pen, the unfinished letter forgotten, and began instead to consider what proof might look like, what actions might speak louder than any apology he could craft, understanding that he had very little time remaining before William Carrow's proposal claimed the answer he so desperately hoped to change. The following morning, Julian rode out toward the cottage at the edge of the estate, though he stopped short of the front step, uncertain of his welcome. Through the small window, he could see Eleanor's father resting in a chair near the fire, his breathing labored but steady, and Eleanor moving quietly about the room, tending to small tasks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. He did not knock. He was not yet ready, and he suspected she was not ready either. Instead, he turned his energy toward the schoolhouse he had already set in motion, riding directly to the building site, where workmen had begun laying the foundation. He spoke with the foreman at length, no longer hiding behind anonymous notes and careful distance, insisting on details that revealed a personal investment far beyond the usual charitable interest of a distant benefactor. He asked about the size of the windows, so the children might have proper light for reading. He asked about the placement of the hearth, so the youngest students would stay warm through the winter months. He asks, specifically, that a small library be included, stocked with books for a village that had never before possessed such a resource. The foreman, a practical man named Edward Marsh, studied the Duke with open curiosity. "Your Grace shows unusual interest in the particulars of a village schoolhouse. Most patrons simply provide the funds and leave the details to us. This project matters to me beyond the usual obligations of charity," Julian said simply, unwilling to explain further, though the truth of his words carried more weight than Edward could have understood. Over the following days, Julian threw himself into the schoolhouse project with an intensity that surprised even his own staff. He arranged for a proper teacher to be hired from the county town, a woman with genuine credentials and a passion for education, ensuring the school would not depend solely on volunteer efforts from villagers already stretched thin by their daily labors. He commissioned proper desks and slates, enough for every child in the village, and arranged for the building to be completed well before the harshest months of winter arrived. Word of the Duke's unusual dedication to the project spread quickly through the village, reaching Eleanor through the same gossip network that had once carried news of William Carrow's courtship. She heard, from one of the other gardeners, that the Duke himself had visited the construction site nearly every day, personally overseeing details that most men of his station would never trouble themselves to consider. Eleanor said nothing when she heard the news, though the gardener who shared it noted a strange, unreadable expression crossing her face before she returned to her work without further comment. She had not spoken to Julian since the day of his aunt's untimely arrival, avoiding the paths near the stables and manor house entirely, though she could not avoid the growing structure of the schoolhouse itself, visible now from nearly every corner of the village, as its walls rose steadily toward completion. Her father's health continued its slow decline, despite the physician's continued care, and Eleanor found herself caught between competing pressures with each passing day. William Carrow visited faithfully, his patience and kindness never wavering, gently pressing for an answer he felt entitled to expect given the length of his courtship. Eleanor's practical mind understood the wisdom of accepting his proposal, securing a stable future for herself and her father, yet her heart remained stubbornly tangled in memories of a stable hand who had listened to her dreams as though they mattered more than anything else in the world. She visited her mother's grave more frequently during those difficult weeks, sitting quietly beside the simple headstone, seeking guidance she knew could never come. She thought often of her mother's words about houses built on sand, weighing them against the practical realities of her situation, unable to reconcile the wisdom of the heart with the wisdom of necessity. The schoolhouse rose steadily in the distance, a constant reminder of the man who had deceived her and yet somehow, impossibly, still seemed to understand her more deeply than anyone else she had ever known. Candles blazed in every window of Ashcombe as carriages lined the long drive, their occupants dressed in silks and jewels for the autumn ball that Lady Constance had spent weeks preparing. Julian stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom, greeting guests with practiced courtesy, though his attention remained fixed on the doorway, half hoping and half dreading that Eleanor might somehow appear among the invited guests, though he knew such a hope was foolish. A gardener's daughter would never receive an invitation to a duke's formal ball. Lady Margaret Fenwick arrived on her father's arm, resplendent in pale blue silk, and made her way directly to Julian's side, with the easy confidence, of a woman who believed the evening's outcome had already been decided in her favor. She spoke pleasantly of the decorations, the music, the impressive gathering of county society filling the room, and Julian responded with the same hollow politeness he had offered her during her earlier visit, his mind elsewhere entirely. The schoolhouse had been completed just 3 days earlier, its doors set to open formally the following week. Yet Julian had heard nothing from Eleanor despite his continued efforts to demonstrate the sincerity behind his earlier deception. He had visited the cottage twice more, each time losing his nerve at the final moment, unable to face the possibility that his actions had come too late to matter. The ball progressed through its early hours, in a blur of dancing and conversation that Julian navigated with mechanical precision, his thoughts consumed by matters far removed from the glittering room around him. It was during a brief pause between dances, as he stood near the refreshment table fielding another round of pleasant nothings from Lady Margaret, that a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A young stable boy, breathless and clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding him, pushed through the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, ignoring the scandalized murmurs that followed his intrusion. He made his way directly toward Julian, his face pale with urgency. "Your Grace," the boy gasped, "forgive the interruption, but Mr. Bell sent me straight away. Miss Hartley's father has taken a grave turn. The doctor has been called, but Mr. Bell thought you would wish to know immediately." The room seemed to still around Julian as the words settled over him, every social obligation and careful pretense falling away in an instant. Lady Margaret's polite smile faltered into confusion as Julian turned to his aunt, who had overheard enough of the exchange to understand something significant was unfolding. "Julian, whatever is happening?" Lady Constance asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to controlling every situation within her sphere. "I must go," Julian said simply, already moving toward the door, shedding his formal coat as he walked, the ballroom, and its glittering expectations, falling away behind him, like a discarded costume. "Julian, you cannot simply abandon your own ball," Lady Constance called after him, scandal evident in every word. But Julian did not slow his pace. He had spent his entire life bound by obligations of rank and expectation, and in this moment, none of it mattered beside the possibility that Eleanor might need him, that her father's failing health might finally claim the outcome she had feared for so long. He rode through the darkness at a reckless pace, his formal evening clothes entirely unsuited for the journey, arriving at the small cottage to find candlelight flickering through the windows and the doctor's horse already tethered outside. He dismounted and hurried to the door, knocking urgently, before pushing his way inside, without waiting for a response. Eleanor sat beside her father's bed, her face streaked with tears, holding his hand tightly as the doctor examined him with grave concentration. She looked up as Julian entered, startled by his sudden appearance, still dressed in the remnants of his formal attire, evidently having come directly from the ball she had heard so much about through village gossip. "Julian," she said, his given name slipping out without the formal title, though her tone carried more confusion than warmth. "What are you doing here? Should you not be at your own ball?" "I came as soon as I heard," Julian said, moving to stand near the foot of the bed, uncertain of his welcome, but unwilling to leave regardless. "Is there anything I can do?" The doctor, a weathered man named Dr. Fairweather who had tended the family for years, straightened from his examination with a weary expression. "His heart is weak, and his lungs struggle more with each passing hour. I have given him what relief I can, but I fear we are approaching the limits of what medicine can offer." Eleanor's shoulders sagged at the doctor's grim assessment, and Julian, without thinking, crossed to her side and knelt beside her chair, offering whatever comfort his presence might provide, despite the tension still lingering between them from weeks of unresolved hurt. "I am not here as the Duke tonight," Julian said quietly, meeting her eyes with as much sincerity as he could convey. "I am here as the man who sat beside you beneath the oak tree, who listened to you speak of your dreams, who cares for you and your father, regardless of what title I carry, or what disguise I wore to earn your trust." Eleanor's tears fell freely now, though she did not pull away from his presence, as she had during their last difficult conversation. "I have been so angry with you," she whispered, "and so confused, because even knowing what you did, even knowing you deceived me, I could not stop thinking of you, could not stop comparing every kindness William offered against the memory of conversations we shared, when I believed you were simply Tom. I never stopped being that man, Julian said softly. Everything I told you, everything I felt, was real. The title changes nothing about my heart, Eleanor. It only changed what you believed about my circumstances. They remained beside her father's bed, through the long hours of the night, taking turns keeping vigil, as Dr. Fairweather did what he could to ease the old man's suffering. Sometime near dawn, as gray light began creeping through the small windows, her father's breathing grew steadier, the immediate crisis passing though his overall condition remained fragile. Dr. Fairweather assured them both that rest and continued care might yet grant him more time, though he cautioned against false hope regarding a full recovery. Exhausted and emotionally spent, Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest against Julian's shoulder as they sat together near the dying fire, neither speaking for a long while, simply grateful for the crisis having passed. I never agreed to William's proposal, Eleanor said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. I told him I needed more time, and he grew frustrated with my hesitation, though he remained too much a gentleman to press further. I think, if I am honest, I always knew my answer would be no, even before you revealed yourself. I simply could not admit it, while my heart remained so thoroughly confused. And now? Julian asked carefully, not daring to hope too much, given everything that remained unresolved between them. Now I do not know, Eleanor admitted honestly. I understand your reasons for the disguise, Julian, and I even understand the fear that drove you to it. But understanding does not erase the hurt of feeling deceived, of wondering how much of what passed between us was genuine, and how much was simply part of your experiment. None of it was an experiment where you were concerned, Julian said firmly. It began that way, perhaps, in my own mind, before I ever spoke with you. But from the moment you offered your hand without gloves or ceremony, everything changed. You were never a test to me, Eleanor. You were the first honest thing I had encountered in years. Eleanor studied him in the pale morning light, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, finding none. The schoolhouse, she said slowly. You built it for the village, but I think, perhaps, you built it partly for me as well, for the dream I once shared with a stable hand, who I believed had no power to make such things happen. I built it because you deserved to see your dream made real, Julian said, regardless of what happened between us. Your feelings for me should never depend on grand gestures, but I wanted you to know that everything you shared with Tom mattered enough to the Duke that he acted on it. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Eleanor rose to answer it, finding Charles Whitmore standing outside, having ridden through the night to locate his employer after the scandalous abandonment of the ball. He delivered the news with careful diplomacy, that Lady Constance and Lady Margaret had both departed Ashcombe in considerable displeasure following Julian's sudden departure, and that rumors were already spreading through county society regarding the Duke's mysterious urgent errand. Julian absorbed this news with far less concern than Charles had expected, understanding that whatever damage had been done to his standing with Lady Margaret's family mattered little compared to the fragile progress he had made with Eleanor through the long hours of the night. He thanked Charles for the update and sent him back to the manor with instructions to manage the fallout as diplomatically as possible, before turning his attention back to Eleanor and the difficult conversation still unresolved between them. I do not expect you to forgive me, simply because I stayed through a difficult night, Julian said honestly. I know trust takes time to rebuild, especially trust broken by deception, however well-intentioned. But I hope you will allow me the chance to prove, through actions rather than words alone, that the man you came to care for as Tom is the same man standing before you now, however different our circumstances might appear. Eleanor considered his words carefully, glancing back toward her father's room, where he now rested more peacefully than he had in days. I cannot make promises tonight, Julian. My father's health remains uncertain, and I have my own heart to untangle from weeks of confusion and hurt. But I am willing to allow you the chance you ask for, provided you understand that trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt through grand gestures alone. It requires patience and honesty, sustained far longer than a single night of crisis. I understand, Julian said, and meant it fully, recognizing that whatever future might exist between them would require far more than the dramatic gesture of the schoolhouse or his hurried departure from the ball. It would require the same quiet, consistent honesty that had first drawn Eleanor to a simple, stable hand, offered now without the protection of disguise, exposed fully to whatever judgment she chose to render upon the truth of who he really was. In the days that followed, Julian returned to Ashcombe to find the household in a state of quiet upheaval. Lady Constance received him with cold formality, her disappointment evident in every clipped word she offered regarding his abrupt departure from the ball. Word had already reached her, through channels Julian did not bother to trace, that his urgent errand had led him to a gardener's cottage rather than any matter of estate business, and she made her disapproval known without hesitation. "You humiliated Lady Margaret before half the county," Lady Constance said, pacing the length of the drawing room with barely contained frustration. "Her father is furious, and rightly so. What am I to tell them, Julian? That the Duke of Ashcombe abandoned his own ball to tend a village girl's ailing father?" "You may tell them exactly that," Julian said calmly, "for it happens to be the truth, and I find I no longer have any interest in disguising it." He met his aunt's disapproving stare without flinching. "I know you wish to see me settled, Aunt Constance, and I understand the pressures you face regarding the family name. But I will not marry a woman I do not love, simply to satisfy expectations I never chose for myself." Lady Constance studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, as she seemed to truly consider her nephew for the first time in years. "You have changed these past weeks," she said finally, her tone softening slightly. "I do not yet understand the cause, but I confess, I have not seen you speak with such conviction since before your father passed." Julian did not offer further explanation, though he found himself grateful that his aunt's anger had cooled enough to allow honest conversation, rather than continued lecture. He spent the following days dividing his attention between estate business that had accumulated during his weeks in disguise and careful, measured visits to Eleanor's cottage, always brief, always respectful of the boundaries she had asked him to honor. He did not press her for answers or declarations of forgiveness. Instead, he simply showed up, day after day, offering practical help wherever it was needed. He arranged for a proper physician to visit regularly, rather than relying on occasional charitable gestures. He ensured firewood was delivered before the coldest months arrived. He listened, when Eleanor was willing to speak, and remained quietly present when she was not, never pushing beyond what she seemed ready to offer. The schoolhouse opened formally the following week, and the entire village gathered to celebrate its completion. Eleanor attended alongside the other villagers, watching with evident emotion as the new teacher led the first group of children through the freshly painted doors. Their excitement palpable as they discovered real desks and real books for the first time in their young lives. Julian stood at a respectful distance during the ceremony, understanding that this moment belonged to the village and to Eleanor's long-held dream, not to any need of his own for recognition or gratitude. Eleanor found him afterward, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, and approached with an expression more open than any she had offered since the truth of his identity had emerged. "You did not need to attend today," she said. "I imagine a duke has more pressing matters than a village schoolhouse opening." "There is nowhere else I would rather be," Julian said honestly. "This was your dream, long before it became my project, Eleanor. I only provided the means. The vision belonged entirely to you." Eleanor watched the children through the schoolhouse windows, their laughter carrying faintly across the autumn air. "William has stopped calling," she said quietly, changing the subject with evident deliberation. "I told him plainly, several days ago, that I could not offer him what he deserved, that my heart belonged elsewhere, even if that elsewhere remained complicated and uncertain." Julian's chest tightened with cautious hope, though he kept his expression carefully measured, unwilling to presume too much from her admission. "I am sorry if my actions caused him pain," he said. "He seemed a genuinely good man." "He was," Eleanor agreed, "and I hope he finds someone who can offer him the whole of her heart, rather than the divided attention I could only ever give him." She turned to look at Julian directly, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "I am not yet ready to say, all is forgiven between us, Julian, but I find myself grateful, each day, that you have not given up asking for the chance to earn that forgiveness properly." "I do not intend to give up," Julian said simply. "Not on this, and not on you." Eleanor's expression softened into something that resembled the warmth she had once offered so freely to a stable hand named Tom. though tempered now by the hard-won wisdom of weeks spent reconciling betrayal with genuine affection. Then perhaps, she said carefully, we might begin again, slowly, and see where honesty, given freely on both sides this time, might lead us. It was not a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was enough, Julian understood, to build upon. A foundation of careful truth, replacing the disguise that had first brought them together. And he allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to hope that the future might yet hold the life he had glimpsed so briefly during his time among the stables and gardens of his own estate. Frost covered the garden beds where roses had once bloomed through the autumn months, and Julian found himself walking the familiar path toward Eleanor's cottage, with a steadiness of purpose he had lacked during those uncertain weeks, following the revelation of his true identity. Winter had settled over Ashcombe, bringing with it a quiet rhythm that felt entirely different from the frantic pace of his earlier deception. Eleanor's father had grown stronger over the following months, aided by consistent medical care and the warmth of a well-stocked cottage that no longer required Eleanor to choose between coal and food during the coldest weeks. He could walk short distances now, on good days, and had even begun assisting occasionally at the schoolhouse, sharing his knowledge of bookkeeping with the older children, eager to learn practical skills alongside their letters. Julian and Eleanor had spent the winter months rebuilding their relationship with the same patience Eleanor had requested that day beside the schoolhouse. Julian visited regularly, never presuming familiarity beyond what Eleanor offered freely, content simply to be present in her life, in whatever capacity she allowed. He learned to listen more carefully than he ever had in London, understanding that trust rebuilt required consistency far more than grand declarations. Slowly, cautiously, the warmth between them returned, though tempered now by a deeper honesty than their early conversations beside the paddock fence had contained. Eleanor spoke openly of her fears and doubts, no longer hiding behind polite reserve, and Julian answered every question she posed about his life, his responsibilities, his own fears regarding love and trust, without the careful omissions that had once defined his disguise. "I still think of you sometimes as Tom," Eleanor admitted one evening, as they walked together along the frozen garden path, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, in a gesture that had become comfortable between them over the preceding weeks. "Not because I wish you were still hiding, but because Tom was the man who first showed me who you truly are, beneath all the titles and expectations." "I have come to think Tom taught me a great deal as well," Julian said thoughtfully. "About patience, about honest work, about the value of being seen for something other than my name. I do not regret the disguise, even knowing the pain it caused, because it led me to understand myself, and you, more fully than I ever could have otherwise." Their relationship deepened through the winter months, and by early spring, Julian found himself standing once again before Charles Whitmore, though this time seeking counsel of an entirely different nature than anonymous notes and careful schemes. "I intend to ask Eleanor to marry me," Julian said plainly, watching his steward's expression carefully for any sign of the disapproval he half expected, given the significant difference in their stations. "I know such a match will raise eyebrows throughout the county, and I know my aunt will require considerable convincing. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Charles, who had watched the entire situation unfold from its earliest days, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "Your Grace, I confess I have been waiting for this conversation for some months now. Miss Hartley has proven herself, through every difficulty this winter presented, to possess exactly the character a man in your position should value above rank or fortune. I believe your father, had he lived to see it, would have approved wholeheartedly." The mention of his father struck Julian with unexpected emotion. His father had married for duty rather than love, a fact Julian had always understood but rarely discussed openly, and the quiet sadness that had colored his parents' marriage throughout his childhood had shaped much of his own reluctance toward the calculated courtships expected of his station. Choosing Eleanor felt, in many ways, like choosing a different path entirely from the one his family history had seemed to demand. Lady Constance, when informed of Julian's intentions, reacted with far less resistance than he had anticipated, though her acceptance took considerable persuasion and no small amount of patience on Julian's part. "She is not what I imagined for you," Lady Constance admitted during a lengthy conversation in the drawing room. "But I have watched you these past months, Julian, and I confess, you seem more content, more genuinely yourself, than I have witnessed since before your father's passing." Perhaps that counts for more than the connections and fortune I once believed necessary for your happiness." With his aunt's reluctant blessing secured, Julian turned his attention toward planning a proposal worthy of everything Eleanor had taught him about honesty and genuine affection. He rejected every elaborate scheme that occurred to him, understanding that grand gestures had never been what drew Eleanor to him in the first place. She had fallen for a stable hand who listened to her dreams, who valued her honesty above any performance of wealth or status, and he intended his proposal to honor that truth, rather than overshadow it with unnecessary spectacle. He chose, instead, the old oak tree near the chapel, the same tree beneath which Eleanor had once taught village children their letters, the same spot where she had first spoken of her dream for a proper schoolhouse. He arranged nothing elaborate, no orchestra or crowd of witnesses, only himself and a small velvet box containing a ring that had belonged to his mother, chosen specifically because it carried the weight of genuine family history rather than ostentatious display. Eleanor arrived at the appointed time, having been invited under the simple pretense of discussing the schoolhouse's continued progress, and found Julian waiting beneath the bare branches of the winter oak, his expression carrying an emotion she had come to recognize well over their months of careful courtship. "You look nervous," Eleanor observed, studying him with growing curiosity as she approached. "That is unusual for a duke accustomed to addressing entire ballrooms of society." "I find that certain conversations matter far more than any I have conducted in a ballroom," Julian said, taking her hands in his own. "Eleanor, I have spent months trying to prove, through action rather than words, that the man you first knew as Tom was never a disguise concealing my true nature, but rather my true nature finally freed from the expectations that had constrained it for years. I do not wish to hide any longer, from you or from anyone else. I wish to build a life with you, openly and honestly, for whatever years we are granted together." He lowered himself to one knee, the velvet box opening to reveal his mother's ring, its simple elegance catching the pale winter light. "Eleanor Hartley, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because a duke asks it of you, but because a man who loves you completely, faults and title and all, cannot imagine building his future with anyone else." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though her smile shone brighter than Julian had ever seen it, brighter even than the day the schoolhouse first opened its doors. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you, not the duke, but the man who taught me that titles matter far less than the honesty of a person's heart." Julian rose and gathered her into his arms, the months of careful rebuilding finally culminating in a moment neither of them had dared to fully imagine, during the darkest days following his revelation. They remained beneath the old oak tree for a long while, simply holding each other, grateful for the winding path that had brought them, despite every obstacle, to this singular moment of certainty. Their wedding took place the following spring, when the garden roses Eleanor had once tended, so carefully bloomed once again, along the estate's pathways. The ceremony was held at the small village chapel rather than the grand cathedral in London that society might have expected, a choice both Julian and Eleanor insisted upon, despite considerable grumbling from certain corners of county society. Villagers filled the pews alongside the more traditional guests of noble standing, and the schoolchildren Eleanor had once taught beneath the oak tree scattered flower petals along the aisle with unrestrained enthusiasm. Eleanor's father, considerably stronger after months of proper care, walked her down the aisle himself, his pride evident in every careful, deliberate step. Thomas Bell and Charles Whitmore stood among the honored guests, both men sharing knowing smiles as they recalled the unlikely beginning of a romance that had started with a borrowed stable-hand's shirt and an injured groom's fortunate accident. Lady Constance, who had come to genuinely admire her new niece over the preceding months, wept openly during the ceremony, later confessing to anyone who would listen that she had never witnessed a match built on such genuine, uncomplicated affection, a rarity indeed within the calculated world of noble marriages she had known her entire life. Following the wedding, Eleanor took on an active role in overseeing the continued growth of the village schoolhouse, expanding its offerings to include older students seeking practical trades alongside the younger children learning their basic letters. Julian, for his part, found himself far more engaged with the daily management of the estate than he had ever been before his weeks in disguise, applying the hands-on understanding he had gained during his time as Tom to policies that genuinely benefited the tenants and workers who depended upon Ashcombe for their livelihoods. Years later, when their own children grew old enough to ask about how their parents had first met, Julian and Eleanor would share the story together, each adding details the other had forgotten, laughing over the near discoveries and awkward misunderstandings that had once seemed so fraught with danger and heartbreak. They spoke of the accident that first brought Julian to the stables, of roses tended with careful devotion, of a schoolhouse built from genuine love rather than mere obligation, and of the old oak tree that had witnessed both a devastating betrayal and, eventually, the promise of a lifetime built on honesty finally, fully embraced. In the first year of their marriage, Eleanor faced considerable resistance from certain quarters of society who whispered behind fans and closed doors about the gardener's daughter who had somehow captured a duke's affections. She bore these whispers with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her life, refusing to let unkind gossip diminish the genuine happiness she had found. Julian, for his part, made it a point to include her fully in every aspect of estate management and social obligation, never once suggesting she should hide her origins or apologize for the modest circumstances of her upbringing. At the first formal dinner Eleanor hosted as the new Duchess of Ashcombe, several of the more traditional families arrived, expecting to find a woman unprepared for the responsibilities of her new station. Instead, they discovered someone who spoke thoughtfully on matters of estate management, who had personally overseen the expansion of educational opportunities throughout the county, and who greeted every guest, regardless of rank, with the same genuine warmth she had once offered a stranger in stable clothes. By the end of the evening, even the most skeptical among Lady Constance's acquaintances had begun to reconsider their initial judgments. Eleanor's father lived to see his daughter settled and happy, his health continuing its slow but steady improvement under the consistent care Julian ensured he received. He spent his final years as a respected figure within the village, teaching bookkeeping at the very schoolhouse his daughter had once dreamed of building, and he often told anyone who would listen that watching Eleanor find genuine happiness had been the greatest gift of his later years, worth more than any fortune he might have wished to leave her. William Carow, whose heart had understandably taken time to mend following Eleanor's refusal, eventually found happiness of his own with a merchant's daughter from a neighboring county, a match built on mutual affection that Eleanor was genuinely pleased to learn of when the news reached her, some 2 years after her own wedding. She wrote him a warm letter of congratulations, grateful that their brief courtship, however complicated it had once seemed, had ultimately led both of them toward the futures they were truly meant to find. The schoolhouse Eleanor had once only dreamed of grew into something far larger than either she or Julian had initially imagined. Within 5 years, it had expanded to include a proper library stocked with hundreds of donated books, and neighboring villages began sending their own children to benefit from the quality education Eleanor had worked tirelessly to establish. She trained additional teachers herself, drawing on her years of experience gathering children beneath the old oak tree, ensuring that her original vision could continue growing long after her own direct involvement might eventually need to lessen. Julian, meanwhile, became known throughout the county as a landlord who genuinely understood the daily struggles of those who worked his land, a reputation earned through his weeks of humble labor that he never regretted, despite the pain that period had also caused. He implemented fairer terms for his tenant farmers, improved housing conditions for estate workers, and personally reviewed conditions in the stables and fields with a thoroughness that surprised neighboring landowners accustomed to more distant, hands-off management from men of his station. Thomas Bell remained at Ashcombe for the remainder of his working years, often regaling new stable hands with the story of the winter a duke had disguised himself as a groom, though he always told the tale with careful discretion, never revealing enough detail to embarrass either Julian or Eleanor, simply offering it as proof that even the grandest among them remained, at heart, capable of genuine humility and honest love. On quiet evenings, long after the demands of estate management and charitable projects had settled into comfortable routine, Julian and Eleanor often found themselves walking the same garden paths where their story had first begun. Past roses Eleanor still insisted on tending personally, despite having a full staff of gardeners at her disposal. She claimed the work kept her grounded, a reminder of where she had come from, and how far genuine love could carry two people willing to fight past deception and doubt toward something real. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked him once, many years into their marriage, as they walked together beneath a summer sky streaked with the colors of approaching sunset. The disguise, the deception, everything that nearly kept us apart before it eventually brought us together? Julian considered the question seriously, as he always did with matters that mattered to Eleanor. "I regret the pain it caused you," he said honestly. "I regret every moment you spent doubting my sincerity, every tear my deception caused. But I cannot regret the path that led me to truly know you, Eleanor, stripped of every title and expectation that might have otherwise kept us from finding each other honestly. Sometimes I think we needed that disguise, however painful its unraveling, to strip away everything false between us and leave only what was genuinely true." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as they continued their walk through the gardens that had witnessed the earliest days of their unlikely love story. "I think," she said softly, "that whatever path brought us here, I am simply grateful it did. Duke or stable hand, you have always been, to me, simply the man who taught me that being truly seen is worth more than any fortune or title the world might offer." And so their story continued, built not on the foundation of calculated advantage or convenient alliance that so often defined marriages within their society, but on the rare and precious foundation of two hearts that had found each other honestly, weathered the storm of deception and doubt, and emerged on the other side with a love strong enough to last a lifetime, proving that even a duke disguised as a stable boy could find, in the end, exactly the kind of genuine devotion he had once feared did not exist at all. A letter arrived at Ashcombe, bearing a seal Julian did not immediately recognize, its wax pressed with the crest of a distant branch of his family he had rarely thought of since his father's passing. He opened it in his study one autumn morning, 6 years into his marriage, and felt a familiar unease settle over him as he read the carefully worded but unmistakably threatening contents. The letter came from Edmund Ashcombe, a second cousin Julian had met only twice in his life, both times at formal family gatherings, where Edmund's ambition had been thinly veiled beneath polite conversation. Edmund wrote now of concerns regarding the succession of the dukedom, questioning, in language dressed up as familial concern, whether a marriage to a woman of Eleanor's modest origins might be challenged on legal grounds should the matter ever come before the appropriate authorities. Julian read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each pass through its carefully constructed threats. He found Eleanor in the garden, tending the roses as she still did most mornings, despite years of access to a full staff who could easily manage the task themselves, and he handed her the letter without preamble. Eleanor read it slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to quiet anger as the implications became clear. "He believes our children's inheritance could be challenged," she said finally, folding the letter with more force than necessary, "because I was a gardener before I became a duchess." "He believes nothing of the sort," Julian said. "He believes he sees an opportunity, however unlikely, to advance his own claim to the title, should he manage to convince enough of the family, and enough of the courts, that our marriage carries some technical vulnerability. It is nonsense, Eleanor, but nonsense pursued with enough persistence and enough coin can cause genuine damage." They sat together that evening with Charles Whitmore, now well into his later years but no less sharp in matters of estate law and family politics, reviewing every document related to their marriage with careful attention. Charles assured them both that their marriage carried no legal vulnerability whatsoever, properly witnessed and recorded according to every requirement of both civil and church law, but he cautioned that Edmund's true goal likely had less to do with genuine legal challenge and more to do with sowing doubt and scandal throughout society, hoping to pressure Julian into some settlement that would benefit Edmund's own financial interests. "He cannot win in court," Charles said, "but he can make considerable noise trying, and noise alone can cause harm to a family's standing, particularly one that has already weathered its share of gossip regarding the circumstances of the Duchess's origins." Julian's first instinct was to respond with the full force of his own legal resources, crushing Edmund's ambitions before they could gain any traction. Eleanor, however, counseled a different approach, one that drew on the same quiet wisdom that had first drawn Julian to her all those years before. "Fighting him with lawyers and threats will only feed the gossip he hopes to stir," Eleanor said. "Let us instead simply live openly and well, exactly as we always have. Let the county see, through our own conduct, that his claims hold no merit beyond jealousy and ambition. People believe what they witness far more readily than what they merely hear repeated in whispers. Julian considered her counsel carefully, understanding the wisdom within it, even as his protective instincts urged more aggressive action. They agreed, together, to host a substantial gathering at Ashcombe, inviting not only their usual circle of friends and family, but also several families who had remained skeptical of Eleanor's position throughout the early years of their marriage, along with select members of the wider Ashcombe family, including Edmund himself, extending an invitation calculated to demonstrate confidence rather than fear. The gathering, held over a full week in early winter, showcased everything Eleanor had built during her years as Duchess. Guests toured the schoolhouse, now recognized throughout the county as a model of practical education, meeting children who could read and write and calculate figures with a confidence rare among rural villages. They witnessed the improved conditions among the estate's tenant farmers, the fair wages and decent housing that had become standard practice under Julian's more hands-on management. They saw, in every corner of Ashcombe, the tangible results of a partnership built on genuine care rather than calculated advantage. Edmund arrived on the third day of the gathering, his polite smile failing to fully mask his discomfort at the obvious success and contentment surrounding him. He attempted, on several occasions, to draw other guests into conversations, questioning the legitimacy of Julian's marriage, but found little sympathetic audience among people who had witnessed firsthand the genuine good Eleanor had accomplished throughout the county. It was during a quiet moment in the library, away from the main gathering, that Eleanor finally confronted Edmund directly, having noticed him lingering near a group of young lords he had been attempting to influence throughout the visit. "You are welcome at Ashcombe, Edmund," Eleanor said, her tone calm but carrying an undeniable steel beneath its surface. "But I would ask that you cease your efforts to undermine a marriage that has produced nothing but benefit for this estate and everyone who depends upon it. Whatever ambitions you harbor regarding the title, you will not find them furthered through scandal aimed at my character." Edmund studied her for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to such direct confrontation from a woman he had considered, until that moment, an easy target for his schemes. "You speak boldly for a gardener's daughter," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. "I speak boldly because I have earned the right to," Eleanor replied evenly. "I have built a school that has changed the lives of hundreds of children throughout this county. I have helped improve conditions for tenants who once struggled simply to survive each winter. I have loved my husband honestly, through deception and doubt and every difficulty that might have driven a lesser match apart. Whatever claim you believe you hold to this family's legacy, Edmund, you hold nothing compared to what genuine devotion and honest work have already secured." Edmund left Ashcombe 2 days later, his schemes evidently abandoned in the face of such unshakable resolve, and though rumors of his ambitions occasionally resurfaced over the following years, they never again gained sufficient traction to threaten the security Julian and Eleanor had built together. The gathering that had been intended to counter scandal instead became remembered throughout the county as one of the finest events Ashcombe had ever hosted, further cementing Eleanor's reputation as a duchess whose worth extended far beyond the accident of her birth. That winter, as snow settled once again over the garden paths where their story had first begun, Julian found Eleanor in the nursery, watching their 2 children sleep peacefully in the gentle glow of a banked fire. He came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist, as they both looked upon the family they had built together, against every expectation society had once held for a duke's proper marriage. "Edmund thought our love was a weakness to exploit," Julian said quietly. "He never understood that it was, in fact, the very foundation that made this family unshakable." "Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all," Eleanor said, resting her head against his shoulder, as she had done so many times over the years since that first proposal, beneath the old oak tree. "That love built honestly, tested by hardship and proven through consistent devotion, becomes far stronger than any advantage of birth or fortune could ever provide alone." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children sleep, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, whether from ambitious relatives or the ordinary difficulties of life, they would face them together, as they always had, with the same honesty and devotion that had first blossomed between a duke disguised as a stable boy and the gardener's daughter who had spoken to him. From their very first meeting, as though he were already the king she would one day help him become. In the years that followed Edmund's failed scheme, Ashcombe continued to prosper under the steady partnership Julian and Eleanor had built. Their eldest child, a daughter named Charlotte after Eleanor's late mother, grew up spending as much time in the schoolhouse library as in the manor's grand halls, developing her mother's passion for learning alongside her father's careful attention to the responsibilities of their station. Their younger son, William, named in quiet gratitude toward the man whose gentle courtship had once given Eleanor the space to discover her true feelings, showed an early fondness for the stables, often found among the horses with an ease that reminded Julian, with fond amusement, of his own weeks spent hiding among the very same stalls. Word of Ashcombe's unusual duchess spread well beyond the county over the following decade, and Eleanor found herself increasingly sought after for counsel by other estates, hoping to establish similar schools for their own tenant communities. She traveled occasionally to advise on such projects, always returning home with fresh ideas for expanding the education and welfare programs that had become as central to her identity as the roses she still tended each spring. Julian, meanwhile, never fully abandoned the lessons learned during his weeks as Tom the stable hand. He made it a lasting practice to work alongside his tenants and staff, at least one day each season, mucking stalls or mending fences, or helping with the harvest, much to the continued bemusement of neighboring landowners, who found such behavior beneath a man of his station. Julian cared little for their opinions. He had learned, through the most difficult and rewarding experience of his life, that true understanding of the people who depended upon him could never be gained from the distant comfort of a manor house alone. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Julian and Eleanor returned to the old oak tree near the chapel, now grown taller and fuller than it had been on the day of his proposal, and they would sit together beneath its branches, reflecting on the winding path that had brought them together. They spoke often of Thomas Bell, who had passed peacefully some years into their marriage, remembered fondly by the entire estate for his quiet wisdom and unwavering loyalty. They spoke of Charles Whitmore, still serving faithfully as steward well into his later years, his counsel as valued as ever in matters both large and small. And always, in those quiet moments beneath the old oak tree, Eleanor would remind Julian of the truth that had guided them from their very first meeting, that the measure of a person lay not in their title or fortune, but in the honesty of their heart and the consistency of their actions toward those who depended upon them. It was a lesson Julian carried with him through every remaining year of his life, shaping not only his marriage, but his stewardship of Ashcombe itself, ensuring that the legacy he left behind honored the simple, profound truth Eleanor had shown him during those first uncertain days when a duke had disguised himself as a stable boy, only to find, in doing so, the most genuine love he would ever know.